everybody, welcome back to A People's Historian, the show where we read about 30 minutes of history together. My name is Jason Kishinev, and we're going to start chapter 4 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, entitled Tyranny is Tyranny. Remember, if you enjoyed this episode, hit the like and subscribe button, hit that notification bell so you get notified when I make a new video. Let's dig in. Chapter 4, Tyranny is Tyranny. Around 1776, certain important people in the English colonies made a discovery that would prove enormously useful for the next 200 years. About 250. They found that by creating a nation, a symbol, a legal unity called the United States, they could take over land, profits, and political power from favorites of the British Empire. In the process, they could hold back a number of potential rebellions and create a consensus of popular support for the rule of a new, privileged leadership. When we look at the American Revolution this way, it was a work of genius, and the Founding Fathers deserve the odd tribute they have received over the centuries. They created the most effective system of national control devised in modern times and showed future generations of leaders the advantages of combining paternalism with command. Starting with Bacon's rebellion in Virginia, by 1760 there had been 18 uprisings aimed at overthrowing colonial governments. There had also been 6 black rebellions from South Carolina to New York and 40 riots of various origins. By this time also there emerged, according to Jack Green, stable, coherent, effective, and acknowledged local political and social elites. And by the 1760s, this local leadership saw the possibility of directing much of the rebellious energy against England and her local officials. It was not a conscious conspiracy, but an accumulation of tactical responses. After 1763, with England victorious over France in the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, expelling them from North America, ambitious colonial leaders were no longer threatened by the French. They now had only 2 rivals left, the English and the Indians. The British, wooing the Indians, had declared Indian lands beyond the Appalachians out of bounds to whites, the Proclamation of 1763. Perhaps once the British were out of the way, the Indians could be dealt with. Again, no conscious forethought strategy by the colonial elite, but a growing awareness as events developed. With the French defeated, the British government could turn its attention to tightening control over the colonies. It needed revenues to pay for the war, and looked to the colonies for that. Also, the colonial trade had become more and more important to the British economy, and more profitable. It had amounted to about 500,000 pounds in 1700, but by 1770 was worth 2,800,000 pounds, more than 5 times as much. So the American leadership was less in need of English rule, the English more in need of the colonists' wealth. The elements were there for conflict. The war had brought glory for the generals, death to the privates, wealth for the merchants, unemployment for the poor. There were 25,000 people living in New York. There had been 7,000 in 1720 when the French and Indian War ended. A newspaper editor wrote about the growing number of beggars and wandering poor in the streets of the city. Letters in the paper questioned the distribution of wealth. How often have our streets been covered with thousands of barrels of flour for trade, while our near neighbors can hardly procure enough to make a dumpling to satisfy hunger? And yes, it does say dumpling. Gary Noah's study of city tax lists shows that by the early 1770s, the top 5% of Boston taxpayers controlled 49% of the city's taxable assets. In Philadelphia and New York, too, wealth was more and more concentrated. Court-recorded wills showed that by 1750, the wealthiest people in the cities were leaving £20,000, equivalent to about $5 million today. In Boston, the lower classes began to use the town meeting to vent their grievances. The governor of Massachusetts had written that in these town meetings, the meanest inhabitants, by their constant attendance there, generally are the majority and outvote the gentlemen, merchants, substantial traders, and all the better part of the inhabitants. End quote. What seems to have happened in Boston is that certain lawyers, editors, and merchants of the upper classes, but excluded from the ruling circles close to England, men like James Otis and Samuel Adams, organized a Boston caucus, and through their oratory and their writing, molded laboring class opinion called the mob into action and shaped its behavior. This is Gary Noah's description of Otis, who he says, keenly aware of the declining fortunes and the resentment of ordinary townspeople, was mirroring as well as molding popular opinion. We have here a forecast of the long history of American politics. The mobilization of lower class energy by upper class politicians for their own purposes. This was not purely deception. It involved in part a genuine recognition of lower class grievances, which helps to account for its effectiveness as a tactic over the centuries. As Nash puts it, James Otis, Samuel Adams, Royal Tyler, Oxenbridge Thatcher, and a host of other Bostonians linked to the artisans and laborers through a network of neighborhood taverns, fire companies, and the caucus, espoused a vision of politics that gave credence to laboring class views and regarded as entirely legitimate the participation of artisans and even laborers in the political process. In 1762, Otis, speaking against the conservative rulers of the Massachusetts colony represented by Thomas Hutchinson, gave an example of the kind of rhetoric that a lawyer could use in mobilizing city mechanics and artisans. I am forced to get my living by the labor of my hand and the sweat of my brow, as most of you are, and obliged to go through good report and evil report for bitter bread, earned under the frowns of some who have no natural or divine right to be above me, and entirely owe their grandeur and honor to grinding the faces of the poor. Grinding the faces of the poor. Boston seems to have been full of class anger in those days. In 1763, in the Boston Gazette, someone wrote that a few persons in power were promoting political projects for keeping the people poor in order to make them humble. This accumulated sense of grievance against the rich in Boston may account for the explosiveness of mob action after the Stamp Act of 1765. Through this act, the British were taxing the colonial population to pay for the French War in which colonists had suffered to expand the British Empire. That summer, a shoemaker named Ebenezer Mackintosh led a mob in destroying the house of a rich Boston merchant named Andrew Oliver. 2 weeks later, the crowd turned to the home of Thomas Hutchinson, symbol of the rich elite who ruled the colonies in the name of England. They smashed up his house with axes, drank the wine in his wine cellar, and looted the house of its furniture and other objects. A report by colony officials to England said that this was the part of a larger scheme in which the houses of 15 rich people were to be destroyed, a part of a war of plunder, of general leveling and taking away the distinction of rich and poor. It was one of those moments in which fury against the rich went further than leaders like Otis wanted. Could class hatred be focused against the pro-British elite and deflected from the nationalist elite? In New York, that same year of the Boston house attacks, someone wrote to the New York Gazette, "Is it equitable that 99, rather than 999, should suffer for the extravagance or grandeur of one? Especially when it is considered that men frequently owe their wealth to the impoverishment of their neighbors." The leaders of the revolution would worry about keeping such sentiments within limits. Mechanics were demanding political democracy in the colonial cities, open meetings of representative assemblies, public gatherings in the legislative halls, and the publishing of roll call votes so the constituents could check on representatives. They wanted open-air meetings where the population could participate in making policy, more equitable taxes, price controls, and the election of mechanics and other ordinary people to government posts. Especially in Philadelphia, according to Nash, the consciousness of the lower middle classes grew to the point where it must have caused some hard thinking, not just among the conservative loyalists sympathetic to England, but even among leaders of the revolution. By mid-1776, laborers, artisans, and small tradesmen employing extra-legal measures when electoral politics failed were in clear command in Philadelphia. Helped by some middle-class leaders, Thomas Paine, Thomas Young, and others named Thomas, no, just kidding, they launched a full-scale attack on wealth and even on the right to acquire unlimited private property. During the elections for the 1776 convention to frame a constitution for Pennsylvania, a privates committee urged voters to oppose great and overgrown rich men. They will be too apt to be framing distinctions in society. The privates committee drew up a Bill of Rights for the convention, including the statement that an enormous proportion of property vested in a few individuals is dangerous to the rights and destructive of the common happiness of mankind, and therefore every free state hath a right by its laws to discourage the possession of such property. In the countryside where most people lived, there was a similar conflict of poor against rich, one which political leaders would use to mobilize the population against England, granting some benefits for the rebellious poor and many more for themselves in the process. The tenant riots in New Jersey in the 1740s, the New York tenant uprisings of the 1750s and 1760s in the Hudson Valley, and the rebellion in northeastern New York that led to the carving of Vermont out of New York State were all more than sporadic rioting. They were long-lasting social movements, highly organized, involving the creation of governments. They were aimed at a handful of rich landlords, but with the landlords far away, they often had to direct their anger against farmers who had leased the disputed land from the owners. Just as the Jersey rebels had broken into jails to free their friends, rioters in the Hudson Valley rescued prisoners from the sheriff and one time took the sheriff himself as prisoner. The tenants were seen as chiefly the dregs of the people, and the posse that the sheriff of Albany County led to Bennington in 1771 included the privileged top of the local power structure. The land rioters saw their battle as poor against rich. A witness at a rebel leader's trial in New York in 1766 said that the farmers evicted by the landlords had an equitable title but could not be defended in a course of law, yes, course of law, because they were poor, and poor men were always oppressed by the rich. Ethan Allen's Green Mountain Rebels in Vermont described themselves as a poor people, fatigued in settling a wilderness country, and their opponents as a number of attorneys and other gentlemen with all their tackle of ornaments and compliments and French finesse. Land-hungry farmers in the Hudson Valley turned to the British for support against the American landlords. The Green Mountain Rebels did the same, but as the conflict with Britain intensified, the colonial leaders of the movement for independence, aware of the tendency of poor tenants to side with the British in their anger against the rich, adopted policies to win over people in the countryside. In North Carolina, a powerful movement of white farmers was organized against wealthy and corrupt officials in the period from 1766 to 1771, exactly those years when, in the cities of the Northeast, agitation was growing against the British, crowding out class issues. The movement in North Carolina was called the Regulator Movement, and it consisted, says Marvin L. Michael Kay, a specialist in the history of that movement, of class-conscious white farmers in the West who attempted to democratize local government in their respective counties. The regulators referred to themselves as poor industrious peasants, as laborers, the wretched poor, oppressed by rich and powerful designing monsters. The regulators saw that a combination of wealth and political power ruled North Carolina and denounced those officials whose highest study is the promotion of their wealth. They resented the tax system, which was especially burdensome on the poor, and the combination of merchants and lawyers who worked in the courts to collect debts from the harassed farmers. In the western counties where the movement developed, only a small percentage of the households had slaves, and 41% of those were concentrated. To take one sample western county, in less than 2% of the households, period. What? In the western counties where the movement developed, only a small percentage of the households had slaves, and 41% of those were concentrated. To take one sample western county, in less than 2% of the households. The regulators did not represent servants or slaves, but they did speak for small owners, squatters, and tenants. A contemporary account of the regulator movement in Orange County describes the situation. Thus were the people of Orange insulted by the sheriff, robbed and plundered, neglected and condemned by the representatives, and abused by the magistracy, obliged to pay fees regulated only by the avarice of the officer, obliged to pay a tax which they believed went to enrich and aggrandize a few, who lorded it over them continually, and from all these evils they saw no way to escape. For the men in power and legislation were the men whose interest it was to oppress and make gain of the laborer. In that county in the 1760s, the regulators organized to prevent the collection of taxes or the confiscation of the property of tax delinquents. Officials said an absolute insurrection of a dangerous tendency has broke out in Orange County and made military plans to suppress it. At one point, 700 armed farmers forced the release of 2 arrested regulator leaders. The regulators petitioned the government on their grievances in 1768, citing the unequal chances the poor and the weak have in contentions with the rich and powerful. In another county, Anson, a local militia colonel complained of the unparalleled tumults, insurrections, and commotions which at present distract this county. At one point, 100 men broke up the proceedings at a county court, but they also tried to elect farmers to the assembly, asserting that a majority of our assembly is composed of lawyers, clerks, and others in connection with them. In 1770, there was a large-scale riot in Hillsborough, North Carolina, in which they disrupted a court, forced the judge to flee, beat 3 lawyers and 2 merchants, and looted stores. The result of all this was that the assembly passed some mild reform legislation, but also an act to prevent riots and tumults, and the governor prepared to crush them militarily. In May of 1771, there was a decisive battle in which several thousand regulators were defeated by a disciplined army using cannon. 6 regulators were hanged. Kay says that in the 3 western counties of Orange, Anson, and Rowan, where the regulator movement was concentrated, it had the support of 6,000 to 7,000 men out of a total white taxable population of about 8,000. That's a lot. That's like what, 87% of the people? One consequence of this bitter conflict is that only a minority of the people in the regulator counties seem to have participated as patriots in the Revolutionary War. Most of them probably remained neutral. Fortunately for the revolutionary movement, the key battles were being fought in the north, and here in the cities the colonial leaders had a divided white population. They could win over the mechanics, who were a kind of middle class, who had a stake in the fight against England, who faced competition from English manufacturers. The biggest problem was to keep the propertyless people, who were unemployed and hungry in the crisis following the French War, under control. In Boston, the economic grievances of the lowest classes mingled with anger against the British and exploded in mob violence. The leaders of the independence movement wanted to use that mob energy against England, but also to contain it so that it would not demand too much from them. When riots against the Stamp Act swept Boston in 1767, they were analyzed by the commander of the British forces in North America, General Thomas Gage, as follows. The Boston mob, raised first by the instigation of many of the principal inhabitants, allured by plunder, rose shortly after of their own accord, attacked, robbed and destroyed several houses, and amongst others, that of the lieutenant governor. People then began to be terrified at the spirit they had raised, to perceive that popular fury was not to be guided, and each individual feared he might be the next victim to their rapacity. The same fears spread through the other provinces, and there has been as much pains taken since to prevent insurrections of the people as before to excite them. Gage's comments suggest that leaders of the movement against the Stamp Act had instigated crowd action, but then became frightened by the thought that it might be directed against their wealth too. At this time, the top 10% of Boston's taxpayers held about 66% of Boston's taxable wealth, while the lowest 30% of the tax-paying population had no taxable property at all. The propertyless could not vote, and so, like blacks, women, and Indians, could not participate in town meetings. This included sailors, journeymen, apprentices, and servants. Dirk Horder, a student of Boston mob actions in the Revolutionary period, calls the revolutionary leadership the Sons of Liberty type drawn from the middling interest and well-to-do merchants, a hesitant leadership, wanting to spur action against Great Britain, yet worrying about maintaining control over the crowds at home. It took the Stamp Act crisis to make this leadership aware of its dilemma. A political group in Boston called the Loyal Nine, merchants, distillers, ship owners, and master craftsmen who opposed the Stamp Act, organized a procession in August 1765 to protest it. They put 50 master craftsmen at the head, but needed to mobilize ship workers from the North End, mechanics, and apprentices from the South End. 2,000 or 3,000 were in the procession. Negroes were excluded. They marched to the home of the stamp master and burned his effigy. But after the gentlemen who organized the demonstration left, the crowd went further and destroyed some of the stamp master's property. These were, as one of the Loyal Nine said, amazingly inflamed people. The Loyal Nine seemed taken aback by the direct assault on the wealthy furnishings of the stamp master. The rich set up armed patrols. Now a town meeting was called, and the same leaders who had planned the demonstration denounced the violence and disavowed the actions of the crowd. As more demonstrations were planned for November 1st, 1765, when the Stamp Act was to go into effect, and for Pope's Day, November 5th, steps were... Pope's Day, November 5th? We don't celebrate that. I wonder what made us decide to stop celebrating that holiday. As more demonstrations were planned for November 1st, 1765, when the Stamp Act was to go into effect, and for Pope's Day, November 5th, steps were taken to keep things under control. A dinner was given for certain leaders of the rioters to win them over. And when the Stamp Act was repealed, due to overwhelming resistance, the conservative leaders severed their connections with the rioters. They held annual celebrations of the first anti-Stamp Act demonstration, to which they invited, according to Horder, not the rioters, but mainly upper and middle class Bostonians who traveled in coaches and carriages to Roxbury or Dorchester for opulent feasts. When the British Parliament turned to its next attempt to tax the colonies, this time by a set of taxes which it hoped would not excite as much opposition, the colonial leaders organized boycotts. but they stressed no mobs or tumults. Let the persons and properties of your most inveterate enemies be safe. Samuel Adams advised no mobs, no confusions, no tumult. And James Otis said that no possible circumstances, though ever so oppressive, could be supposed sufficient to justify private tumults and disorders. They all three chose to use the word tumult. You think that was coordinated? Probably never know. Impressment and the quartering of troops by the British were directly hurtful to the sailors and other working people. After 1768, 2,000 soldiers were quartered in Boston, and friction grew between the crowds and the soldiers. The soldiers began to take the jobs of working people when jobs were scarce. Mechanics and shopkeepers lost work or business because of the colonists' boycott of British goods. In 1769, Boston set up a committee to consider of some suitable methods of employing the poor of the town, whose numbers and distresses are daily increasing by the loss of its trade and commerce. On March 5th, 1770, grievances of rope makers against British soldiers taking their jobs led to a fight. A crowd gathered in front of the custom house and began provoking the soldiers, who fired and killed first Crispus Attucks, a mulatto worker, then others. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Feelings against the British mounted quickly. There was anger at the acquittal of 6 of the British soldiers. 2 were punished by having their thumbs branded and were discharged from the army. The crowd at the massacre was described by John Adams, defense attorney for the British soldiers, as a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jack tars. Perhaps 10,000 people marched in the funeral procession for the victims of the massacre, out of a total Boston population of 16,000. This led England to remove the troops from Boston and try to quiet the situation. And let's end the episode there. I'd like to thank you for joining me. Hit that like and subscribe button and that notification bell. We'll see you next time.